Well, actually, there's some interesting research out there that there are ways to build that even in resistant people, which I'm really fascinated by right now. Especially some of it's coming out of the therapeutic or the psychoanalytic literature.
Yeah.
That you can, and something I was mentioning before, is that the way that you invite people into a process or a moment or a conversation, even the way you ask a question, increases editability, increases the possibility that they'll actually develop. It's funny, the word develop is fascinating to me because develop means change. And so when we ask a leader to develop, we're asking them to change.
This is the Brandon Smith Show, and of course, I'm your host, Brandon Smith, and the entire purpose of the show is one singular thing: that's to help you live a life that much more free from dysfunction. So today we're going to talk about leadership. In fact, we're going to talk about whole, intentional leader development, and we're going to talk more about what that means to be kind of a whole and intentional leader and how to develop leaders that way. And to kind of take us on this journey, my amazing guest for us is Dr. Rob McKenna. Rob, so glad to have you on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brandon.
Yeah.
Plus, it's awfully fun to look at your setup there because you look like you're in a place where I would like to work.
I totally, like, who doesn't want to work with like 30 bobbleheads? I
Who
mean,
doesn't?
that's like the best. And you know what, Rob? They always agree with me. That's the best thing about working with 30 bobbleheads. You have 30 people agree with everything you say. It's amazing.
That's
It's
good.
great.
I'm getting some bobbleheads.
Yeah. So so you and I got to chat a little bit before the show, just in terms of planning for this, and we were talking about some different paths, and all of them sound interesting. So I love, while we have this theme of whole and intentional leader development, I have a feeling that there's a lot of pathways we're going to take down that. And so before we go too much further down, I want to make sure I let everyone know kind of who you are, and then hear a little bit more about how you got doing this. So you're the CEO of Wild Leaders Incorporated, creator of the Wild Toolkit, and chair of industrial organizational psychology at Seattle Pacific University. Did I miss anything?
That sounds pretty good.
That's a pretty awesome set of hats right there. That's great. So tell us a little bit about what does it mean to be a whole intentional leader? How did you get doing this? What's been kind of your story? And then we'll start to dive into down some of these pathways.
I'm Brandon, I don't think you maybe didn't know this part, but I'm the son of a 3-time university president. My dad was in that role through my whole childhood, and I think it really started there because my folks were leading in a time when if something went haywire, that sounds like my dad right there. That's a word he would use, haywire. If something went amiss, things were going to show up in the local newspaper. It was a time where, and on a university campus, you can imagine how difficult it is to manage and lead faculty. And because part of my role is I am one, I understand that very well. But as a kid, I think it gave me a real motivation. I don't think I knew what was building at the time, but our dinner table was kind of like a boardroom, I think, in many cases, because, or at least maybe a coaching session, even as a child, because my folks found that as soon as everyone you know works for you, it becomes a different kind of dynamic. And so it gave me a heart early on for leaders. I talk about so often that I don't really care about leadership, but I care deeply about the experience of leaders because these are the folks who are setting the pace for how things are going to be. And so I've spent my career, as you were saying, in this world between, I'm a bit of a mutt. I'm part academic, part scientist, but then I've also been a career consultant working with, I'm old enough now to say it's where your resume gets long enough you can't remember all the places, but a lot of, big corporations, but also nonprofits and different places that are doing service work around the world and educational institutions. And I'm just drawn right to the leaders and more specifically into applying what we know from about 40 years of research on the experience of leaders, because there's some really good work out there that has had a profound shaping in what's happening in corporate America around this stuff. But and so I've just been drawn into continuing to try to support the development of whole people and try to move away from piecemeal approaches and say, like, what would it mean if we looked at the real experience? One of my friends said, he said, Rob, you're about the conversations that we whisper out loud but scream out inside of us. And so I think part of my job has been to architect spaces where people could get real, but in a safe way. And so that's what it's been about. And I think I mentioned this before we started, that I feel like, I'm now, I just turned 51, and I feel like I'm catching my stride now. So it's
That's
been a
cool.
pretty awesome. I mean, I feel like I'm in a really good moment right now. So it started with my folks, and then I've been in this world and been able to work with some amazing places. And so, yeah, that's that whole person focus.
Yeah. It almost, I'm putting on my therapist hat for a minute. It almost sounds like you're trying to give the gift of that dinner table conversation for all the people you work with. To have that.
Dude, no one has ever said that, and I, I think you're. I'm going to be using that. My friend Brandon Smith told me, that is a wonderful gift you just gave me because I think you're right. I think that's exactly
Yeah.
what I've been attempting to do for the last 25 years.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah,
Yeah,
I love that, and it is a gift. So
yeah,
I'm really curious. You mentioned this when you were talking about kind of the stuff that really gets you excited. And you talk about kind of the whole person, right, or the whole leader, and giving them space and architect space for those conversations. What does it mean to be a whole and intentional leader?
yeah. I do this thing where you know how back in the '80s, maybe in the '90s, we were really interested in the difference between a leader and a manager,
Yeah.
and trying to find that. And I always mention to people that we played a game as kids that was about this, and so everybody knows what the game is, although they vary between follow the leader and Simon Says. But people knew that. And one thing I always mention to people is I say when as kids when we started playing the game, no kid ever came up and said, "Before we start, could we define the difference between a manager and a leader?" Because I don't really understand that. But we knew how to play, and no one had to tell us the rules. And so one of the ways that I define a leader is that the leader goes first, just simply stated. And oftentimes, and I'll talk about or give sort of object examples of this. But when a person goes first, it changes it quantitatively and qualitatively changes their position with everybody else. And it's one of the reasons that I have a little bit of difficulty with the statement that everyone is a leader all the time, because it's just
Mm.
research wouldn't support it. It's just I think it disqualifies everything we know about the experience of actually going first. So what I did then is then I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, and there's this depth and breadth of knowledge about what the experience of leaders looks like. And when you imagine someone going first, you realize that there's all this research around kind of what is that experience like, including motivations, purpose, and sometimes people talk about calling or their goals, their experiences in the past, their competencies, their support networks, how they're investing in the development of other people. All that stuff is going on all the time, but yet they're in a very isolated position when they go first. People are now like they're going to succeed or they're going to fail, and everyone's going to watch when it happens. They're going to take hits like never before. So what I really, when I talk about whole person development, it's taking that all that we know about that experience and then building scaffolding is what I describe it around that experience so that people could be more intentional. I think I mentioned to you I was speaking at this kind of this cool conference this week, and I asked people in the room. I said there's about 200 people in the room, and I said how many of you got any preparation whatsoever, or got no preparation whatsoever for your first leadership role? And I bet 90% of the people in the room
Oh,
raise
the
their hand.
hands go up.
No one gets any preparation for what it's going to be like to stand there out in front first. And so when I talk about whole, I think this is one really basic example. I'll finish with two, is just this conversation between the things that we can see and the things that we can't. So, for example, budgets and mission statements and goals and quotas and all these and systems we put in place that we can see are in constant communication with the things that we can't. And the things that we can't are things like our motivations. You know what I mean? Our passions,
Mm.
our the things that are getting us down. It's this basic psychology. I think this is where my training as a psychologist, right, comes directly in line, or not in line with, but sort of face to face with the reality of the things that we can. And
Mm.
they're impacting each other all the time. So this isn't the soft stuff. I describe psychology not as the soft science, but the harder science. You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
it's things that we're trying to understand that we can't see. So I hope that helps.
Oh, totally. All right. So I definitely want to make sure we talk about your book before we move into it, and this may pivot into that actually. So my listeners here, many of them are in leadership roles. I'm certain none of them got proper training for those roles. So what are some things that they can be thinking about or equipping themselves with that will support them better as leaders?
Yeah. So this is also a shameless plug for the product I developed. But you mentioned the WILD toolkit, and
Yeah.
by the way, WILD, the acronym stands for Whole and Intentional Leader Development. So it is my one good kind of statement about what we do. And what I was focused on is I think I didn't realize this when I started this about 10 years ago, but I wanted to, instead of going around and speaking about what this would look like, I don't want to just to inspire people. I wanted to leave them with a scaffolding and a process for doing that. So I ended up creating this set of assessments, and we call them whole leader. It's a whole leader process or system where it's 10 different developmental moments. And I say that because it's when you say like, how do we go about doing this? I think it takes intention, and that's something that's difficult for people because the first thing that we bail on is our own development, and then the moment comes and we wish we had done a little bit of that preparation for whatever that moment is. I would say one thing that I've learned regarding the use of the toolkit, and this is probably some of I think my most forward thinking that other people are doing as well, is that so much of our learning and growth is about the way that we invite people into their own development.
Hmm.
That actually you can build efficacy, which is psychologically speaking, is a huge component of all kinds of other outcomes that we want. But you can actually build efficacy even in they call it developmental efficacy, even in people who are resistant. So it's so interesting because so often I get called in because we've got some troubled executive, right? We got some person that the CEO can't make sense out of this one VP who's causing trouble for everybody. But what's fascinating is if you invite people into their own development, that it actually begins to shift their mindset. It reminds me of all the Carol Dweck work around growth mindset. And it's really fascinating how that. Let me give you one example. Is like I had a leader say who's going to get in front of 1,000 people in this organization and say, what all of you should be doing is developing your people. And I said, can I edit you right now? Instead of saying what you should be doing, because no one wants to be should have into anything. I said, what if you ask them, what would change if you were making a better investment in the people on your short list? And it's like now everybody's development, they're like, oh, I could do that as opposed to I should do that. And so it's just, I'm excited about the way that the conversation is shifting and the work we're able to do. And I realize that's what I think the toolkit is doing. And I hope for folks that are out there that might be inspiring to them to maybe kind of change the way that they ask questions today.
Yeah. So it can be the way they ask questions, but also I'm hearing this too, recognize that you need to be caring for yourself and being intentional about developing yourself
Yeah.
and equipping yourself. And your toolkit is one of those great tools out there that can help people do that and help build that scaffolding around them so they are supported. Because when you were talking about that leader, that role, that leader getting out in front, whether it was your dad as a college university president, which by the way, I've often heard and seen in my own experience, college university presidents, principals of public high schools, and like religious leaders or like pastors of large churches. Like those are the three most toughest jobs you can get because you don't have a lot of authority over really anybody and you're being watched and people feel very passionate and deeply committed to those institutions. Hard jobs. And so when you're out there, you're alone. And there's a lot of fear when you're in that role, when you go first. There's a lot of fear and uncertainty. And trying to figure all that out, you need that support system. So it's great that you're trying to help people kind of have that and think about that and then have that.
Yeah, it's the other piece that I'm hoping to do is a part of our Wild Leaders mission statement is to prepare a generation of courageous and sacrificial leaders. And I think to what you were saying is that so often the people who do most quickly emerge into that going first position are people with what we describe as having thicker skins, with a lot less reluctance. And so one of my hopes is also to encourage people who may be a little bit more reluctant to express conviction or to show up like they mean it, and to give them the courage to step out and go first. Because I think we need a lot of those folks who actually get what the stakes are, as opposed to the folks who go, I'll take the job. And so that's part of that mission too, is to provide some scaffolding for folks who might be less likely to step up if we didn't encourage them just a bit more. So,
and some of those folks are some of the best leaders because they're more inclined to listen first. They're more inclined to bring other people along. It's less of an ego thing for them because they recognize they were the right ones for the job, but there wasn't something inherently inside them that said, I want that. I want to be out front with all the spotlight on me.
One of my favorite interview questions for any leader is to ask them, what is it that causes you what is it causes you reluctance to take this role? Is so rarely asked, because if they don't know what the
That's a
grades
great
are,
question. What happens if someone says nothing?
that scares me to death, to be
Me
honest. It
too.
means they're not doing their homework, because my dad would, one of the jobs he took, he didn't realize when he took the job, and this is what's always the case, that the cafeteria at this particular university couldn't pay its milk bills. And so he thought he was going to go in doing all this tremendous, innovative, forward-thinking work, and he spent most of his time in Washington, D.C. for the first year trying to get federal funding to keep this place afloat.
Wow.
So it's like, I want people to ask that question, like they should know.
Yeah. Okay, so we're hitting our first break. So we're going to roll into break. Actually, our first and only break. We're going to roll into break. When we come back, I'm going to go down the path of your book, and I want to really kind of dive into it, because there's some really good nuggets that I would love to kind of ask you about around that. So
Okay.
Stay tuned. We're going to be right back. Here's your coaching minute for the week, presented to you by the Leadership Foundry. Dysfunction in the workplace, it's a pervasive problem. Here's a simple tip to eliminate dysfunction, both in your team, but even in the environments around you. Clarify your team members' roles, goals, and responsibilities. So just spend some time thinking about, does all of my team know? Does each of them know what their role is, what the goals are of the team, and their responsibilities? If the answer is yes, you right there eliminate 50% of all the dysfunction that could come up in your team. If the answer is no, think about how you could do that better. When we don't do that, one of two things happens. Either people overlap work and they step on each other's toes, or you have one person carrying much bigger load while a couple other people are hanging out not doing near as much work. It's one of the big problems in the nonprofit world, is a lack of clarity around roles, goals, and responsibilities. So focus on those three things, and I promise you, not only will you eliminate dysfunction, it's going to make your workplace that much more enjoyable. Okay, welcome back to the Brandon Smith Show. Of course, I'm your host, Brandon Smith, and today we've been talking with Dr. Rob McKenna. Rob, you've been sharing some ideas and thoughts and insights around us, what it means to be a kind of whole and intentional development for leaders, and what it means for us as leaders to kind of do that, and some of the real challenges of being a leader, going out front and having that feeling of being alone, and then how to build the scaffolding around it. So I want to drill into something specific. So your recent book, Composed, The Heart and Science of Leading Under Pressure, tell us a little bit more about where does that book fall within this process of us growing as a leader? And then I've got some questions about it I'd love to ask you.
Yeah. So I had a chance to be involved in several different longitudinal studies a few years back, and had a chance to interview a bunch of different leaders across contexts. And one of the most common challenges when we talk to them about their most impactful developmental moments, they all shared something, whether they were first level leaders, whether they were an executive with a multi-billion-dollar budget. And it was this, is when the conversation started to get personal, and we started to study their more specific journey, it was a fundamental tension between staying true to themselves and what I describe as their convictions or their core values, like what's important to them, and communicating that clearly, and at the very same time connecting with the same information in everybody else. And the challenge was that as soon as they moved into a position of leader, that they were having to deal with multiple different convictions on the outside, but also figuring out how to stay true to their own direction and path. And so it got me really, really interested in that dynamic. Like, why is this the common theme in how people are wrestling with these high pressure kinds of moments in their careers that were they're developmental, developmentally so important. So I ended up studying that process for years, and I didn't find a lot in the leadership literature, to be honest, that sort of looked like what we were seeing. And so the place where I found the most information was actually in marriage and family systems theory.
Oh,
I don't know
cool.
if you're familiar with bond theory.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I dug deep into that literature in terms of people's emotional processing, because we realized that this was the fundamental tension. And what we found in our work was that people had what I describe as a habitual way of responding. They either were defaulting towards self under pressure. So if those pressure moments come, or they were defaulting towards what I describe as peacekeeping in my book. So like truth speaking or peacekeeping was sort of this default tendency, and each side got bigger depending upon the person's tendency. So what we did was we're like, okay, we're understanding something about this dynamic, this emotional dynamic that's systemic in nature. Because if I surround Brandon with a bunch of different people, they're gonna cause him to move toward his habit. Like even it's not just him; he's not trying to be emotionally mature in a vacuum. It's like he's trying to do that within the system people that he functions. So what we studied, that the first part of the book just sets up those habits, and that's all based on one of the assessments in the Wild Toolkit called the Leading Under Pressure Inventory. So we did a bunch of research using that tool. The book starts off with what is your habit, that tendency in those two areas. And then what we wanted to study was what are the strategies that have allowed people to do those two things at the same time? If they're willing to work hard at doing those things, what is it that allows leaders to do that? So the rest of the 11 chapters of the book just break down those strategies that we discovered. And I can tell you, in a moment about the secret sauce. So we've done some research on which strategies are most powerful. We found that they all were important, but there were certain ones that were more impactful than others. And every book is anecdotal. I think it's just autobiographical. I just, it's something that I wrestle with in my own leadership and life is about my own habits. And so I think part of it is you're kind of being a self-therapist, trying to figure out how do I show up better under pressure. So
Fantastic.
That's kind of the foundation of the book.
Yeah, so I actually would love to get a couple of those nuggets from you about some of those strategies you found to be the most impactful. You mentioned 4 C's in there too. Tell us about those.
Okay, so it's funny. I just wrote something up on this yesterday that I've never had a chance to write about. But those 4 C's I talk about. What I mentioned, those either move towards self or towards other, and we're trying to do both at the same time.
Yeah.
Whether it's a conversation with your teenager or whether it's working with your team. And so what I realized in the book is I had to set up a foundation of certain things that need to be in place even before the conversation begins. And so those 4 things were competence. So certainly my feelings and efficacy around my own competence or skill affects how I show up when the pressure comes.
Yeah.
Community of people. If you're not surrounded, it is very difficult to be composed. So if you don't know who's surrounding you, and I don't mean like literally, I mean like, that are around you at a given season of life. The culture that you're in, certain cultures don't actually encourage people to be more mature versions of themselves. And so being aware of that, and then culture, and then character is the last piece that I talk about, because even before I want to say, the book's not going to do you much good if you're not willing to edit. And so I think it takes a character of editability. It's a word that I made up. Someone who's willing to have the backspace key hit on things that even feel like they might be part of their character. And so So editability and willingness to change is sort of a key ingredient in all of it. So that's what those 4 C's that set up that foundation are about.
Yeah, that's really cool. So the last one there, that seems like that's either you got it or you don't. I mean, I don't know if you can coach someone to
edit,
be willing to edit, to be open to that.
Well, actually, there's some interesting research out there that there are ways to build that even in resistant people, which I'm really fascinated by right now. Especially some of it's coming out of the therapeutic or the psychoanalytic literature.
Yeah.
That you can, and something I was mentioning before is that the way that you invite people into a process or a moment or a conversation, even the way you ask a question, increases editability, increases the possibility that they'll actually develop. It's funny, the word develop is fascinating to me because develop means change. And so when we ask a leader to develop, we're asking them to change. Isn't it? And it's like you try to soften that blow and it's not as powerful. It's like that's really what we're asking people to do. And who among us doesn't struggle a little bit with that?
Yeah, totally. Because develop sounds like, oh, I'm getting better. I'm going to grow. It has a positive spin on change.
Yes.
It doesn't.
Right,
it doesn't
exactly.
seem to addict. It doesn't connote or denote that you're going to lose anything.
Absolutely.
Right. You think, I'm just getting more. I'm getting more of good stuff. Like it does. Yeah, whereas change is not. You think, what am I going to lose? I'm going to lose something of this.
Yeah, I love to ask is like, would you be willing to change for the sake of the needs of other people, even if it might hurt a little? Is like that's the last part. It's even if it might hurt a little.
Yeah.
Can I tell you the secret sauce in the book? I'm going to give away the punchline. But
do it.
I think the book still will help. So
there's 11 sections in there. So I mean, people can really go in there for more depth and detail. And so everyone needs to do that. But yeah, I would love to hear some secret sauce.
So we were really interested in if there were one or two of the strategies that were most impactful, and this is the scientist part of me, that were soaking up the most variance in a person's capacity to be composed under pressure, what would they be? And it was fascinating because the number one, by far, the number one strategy was sense of purpose.
Hmm.
It was the extent to which a person knew why they were in the situation before they even started. Like and it takes a little bit of intentional work on saying, like, so why am I a dad? Why am I a manager? Why am I an executive? Why am I, why am I a husband or wife? All these, that if we do some framing around that, it actually helps. It has just a profound impact on my ability to show up well for my sake and others' sake when the pressure comes. The second one was a focus on potential. So it
Hmm.
was the extent to which the person is able to see possibilities, even when everyone else might see barriers. And it's not optimism. So optimism is the half full glass of water, and pessimism is half empty. A focus on potential would be, I have a half full glass of water. What could I do with that? Kind of thinking. So it was the combination of those two things worked especially well for people who take things personally. And we have this
Oh, wow.
massive data set we've been able to study. And what's fascinating about that, Brandon, is that's most people. So most of our sample of folks over the years have been folks it's personal. We're human beings.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the secret sauce. But all of them were important, but those two were pretty powerful
That's
if I were to give
awesome.
general advice.
So I thought of you. You were saying those two things, and two things jumped into my head. One was a quote that I heard from a famous theologian at Emory's Theology School, Emory University here in Atlanta. And he since passed away. The guy's name was Jim Fowler. And he did a
Mhm.
lot on developmental psychology, developmental growth, but within the spiritual space. So he did this kind of research in Harvard and then he did it at Emory. But he used to say, you want to give people hope and handles as a leader. Hope and handles.
Hope it handles.
Hope and handles,
Dude,
which I think
that's
is
amazing.
so cool. It kind of ties into this. Like, how do you reframe
Absolutely.
for other people to give them hope? And then what's the handles, things they can hold on to kind of get there? So it
Yeah.
made me think of that. And then it also made me think of the Blue Zones project that happened about 5 or 6 years ago, where they studied the concentration of centenarians around the world. Like, where's the greatest concentration of 100-year-old people? And they
Huh.
found little pockets like Loma Linda, California, Okinawa, Japan, Nicoya, Costa Rica, Caria, Greece. And when they dove into those communities with all these 100-year-old people and asked why, they found a couple kind of common denominators. Everyone had a sense of purpose. Everyone had a community around them. And then they had like good kind of eating habits and then daily exercise and
Huh.
occasional glass of wine every night too. Which doesn't hurt, but they had the purpose and community too. So
Wow.
it's almost like if you want to live a long time, you need this stuff. So
Yeah.
I love
Sounds
what you
pretty
do, and
whole.
that's
Sounds
great.
pretty whole.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think we're getting close on time here. Isaac will give me a cue, but before we started talking today, I said, what's really kind of on your mind, Rob? What's stuff you kind of kick around right now? And you mentioned this idea of developmental readiness. And I didn't want to ask you before the show because I want to ask you on the show. What does that really mean? And what are you kind of kicking around in your head around that these days?
Yeah, so inside the toolkit, we created a measure of developmental readiness, a developmental readiness index. And when I created it, I really was looking for a way to tap into the whole preparation of a person before they got into the whole developmental process. Like, could we
Mm,
assess where someone is and then assess where they are at the end of the process? And so it's gotten me even deeper now into the literature around that, and into other fields, like I was mentioning before, into psychotherapy and what's known out there, not just industrial organizational psych. What do we know about executive coaching and so on? And what's fascinating about developmental readiness to me, and I think this is where my brain is going, is what does it mean to take a whole perspective on that?
mm,
As opposed to, because sometimes we confuse developmental readiness with effectiveness. And what we're talking about is someone who is in a moment or a season of readiness for change. And so it changes the way we think about even the talent in an organization, because so often we say, like, who are the talent and who's not, as opposed to saying who's developmentally ready for learning and growth. Because there's certain times where my wife would say, like, I don't really want to learn right now, maybe tomorrow, but right now I need something that's a little more routine. You know what I mean?
yeah.
And we need to remind ourselves of that. But I think a whole perspective, I think of it like, if I was stepping up to a starting line of a race and I was a sprinter, what actually would be going on is, what are all the things around me that prepared me for that moment, for that when that starting gun goes off? Like all the training that's gone into that, the coaches and the people that have encouraged me, my understanding of the things I do well. Do I start well? Do I finish well? How I'm going to run that race. All that awareness is something that we would want someone developmentally ready to run the race. Why wouldn't we do the same with leaders? And so that's where I think about. So if we scaffolded the whole development of a person before they ran the race, what would that look like? And we know a lot about that already. And so my work around that has been, we have this quick assessment of that, but it also includes some crazy things. This is where it got even more interesting to me, Brandon, is like, is what does personality have to do with that? So development's the things that I can change, but we know a lot that at least half of, leadership emergence and sometimes even effectiveness is affected by some traits. So how do my traits interact with the readiness that's around me that interact with the context I'm in? So what is my organization trying to do? Does it fit with kind of my skill set and where I'm going? How do I contribute to that? Are all a part of this kind of whole perspective on what it means. Yeah. If I find anyone in a moment, I want to understand those things. So I hope that makes sense, but I've just been kind of geeking out all week about this stuff and in the literature and also my own work around it.
So what I took away from that is we want to consider things like personality, things like self-awareness, things like even season and stage of life. And that can be both professionally, but also personally. Yeah. Like if you got a lot of craziness going on right now in your personal life, maybe it's not a good time to take on something really big and new in your professional life.
Absolutely.
And I've seen that. There was a piece of research that came out. This was some years ago, about 10 years ago. And a couple female researchers and scholars put this together, and they said, we often kind of target kind of the early 40s when we start tapping high potentials, but you miss a lot of women when you do that because when they study kind of neuroscience around women's brains versus men's brains, when there's young kids in the house, it's like man's brain, like one little area is firing. Women's brain, it's like firing all over the brain because they're really thinking about it all the time, even when they're working. And their argument was you'd be better off starting to look for high potentials in the kind of the early 50s, because that's often when kids have gotten older, and for women, they're often ready to take that step where they might not want to in their early 40s. So we miss them because we're not looking at the right windows, was their argument. Absolutely. And makes me think about that, which is totally cool.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah. Time for one more thought on that, or do we need to wrap?
Well, I think Isaac said we're getting close on time. I'll take another thought. I mean, this is like bonus. Okay. I mean, this stuff's gold.
I'll do it fast. So in the whole talent management space, maybe in the past few years, the focus has been on who are your high potentials. So you got your top 15% or something, which makes the rest of us think, well, I'm not that, so I'm in the 85. And then other people would say, if it's talent, look at the top 35%, and then look at the bottom of the top, because those are people who still have room to grow. And the rest of the people way at the top, they don't need to change. And I think this whole concept we've been talking about is more about thinking about who's spinning through that moment of readiness, as opposed to saying it's either these are talented people or not, saying who are the people that are ready to change and grow. And that cycle, that could change in seasons. So it kind of is a different perspective on your whole workforce, to go on the work side of this whole thing and changing the paradigm. So that's my last thought, but it's where
I love it. I love it. This has been great. So, I ask every single one of my guests this question. What's one life hack you have for us to help us live a life more free from dysfunction, either personally or professionally?
Oh, man. I think I would encourage, and I know this is spinning back, but I would encourage people to think about their why. I know that there are a lot of folks talking about that now, but to be intentional about sitting down, and I know it's hard to do, but to think about why you're in the situations that you are in as much as you think about how and what. And I think what I would suggest is that is not squishy, touchy-feely talk, that actually it can have a profound impact on your presence. And we know this from across all the literature that's out there, that how you show up and the interactions with people, the way that you show up is just as important as everything that you do or execute on. And so being intentional about showing up with purpose, it's not just about your purpose, but thinking intentionally about, so how is it that I can best serve those people? And what is my purpose when it comes to that? I guess that's the tidbit I would leave today.
That's a great way to end, man. That's pretty awesome. So if people want to learn more about you, buy your book, follow you, where are some places they can go?
So we're on all the social media channels, and usually look up Dr. Rob McKenna, or Wild Leaders is the other place, and go to wildleaders.org. check out the wildtoolkit.com. It is set up so that people could run with it, and it is completely structured and scaffolded so individual leaders who want to start working with their teams could jump on, grab the toolkit, and off you go and spend a year investing and developing in your people. And it's set up that simply. So, but wildleaders.org to reach out to us.
Rob, awesome. You're a gift, man. Thank you so much for this. This was great. And thank you for listening and watching. Of course, catch a new show every single Sunday at 7:30 p.m. when we drop a new show. And you can listen to us on iTunes and watch us on Facebook.com/Brandon Smith WPT for The Workplace Therapist. And if you haven't checked out The Workplace Therapist, check out that site. It's there for you with resources to help you live a life more free from dysfunction. And until the next show, have a great week and an awesome life.